The Lord be with you. A reading from the conclusion of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. When they saw him, they worshipped, but they doubted. Then Jesus approached and said to them, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. Where's the gospel? I had spent about 20 years designing computer chips when I had this moment when I was driving along this road and I could see off in the distance that there was a large landfill. And I wondered how many of the products that I had helped design were now in that landfill. Now, I happened to be on the way back to the office, and at the time I was about to spend some quality time with a long-awaited computer chip. About 3 months before that moment, we had released the design so that the prototype could be produced. And about 6 months before that, we started working on that computer chip design. And it was a situation where the chip had to be released by a certain date or it would become irrelevant. The schedules in the computer chip world are always brutal, and the executives act as though our very existence depends on the chip getting done quickly, cheaply, and with high quality. So the executive types were always seeking ways to increase the pressure on engineers to work harder and longer hours. Now, one of the big moments in the whole design process of a computer system is when power is applied for the very first time. And the very first system made is this prototype, and it's treated like it's worth millions of dollars. Now, I've actually been on trips. I've been on trips where the sole purpose was to fly to a town where I could receive the prototype as soon as it came off the line, and then run to the airport so that I could carry that item back to the lab. And so that kind of effort might save a day on our schedule. And the managers seem to be kind of view that as very precious, very important time there. Now, when I've been on these trips in the past to carry the prototype from the manufacturing line to the lab, I was all nerve-wracked, because I felt like I was carrying this thing of unbelievable value, and maybe start to wonder if maybe I'm in some Mission Impossible movie, But no, it's just this little chunk of electronics. So going back to the day when I saw this landfill, and we had just received the prototype, and everyone was treating it like it was this big mound of gold or something. And I was ready to see if this thing was going to work. Now, one of the unfortunate aspects of the computer chip design world is that, even though you have all the tools that will tell you whether or not this thing is actually going to be okay and hooked up right and work, there's always some stuff that you do by hand, some things that you kind of have to craft. And there's a danger, in that spot there because, unfortunately for me, I've been lucky enough to avoid the terrible fate of putting in a chip killer bug. But I've seen others be not so lucky. And sadly, the chip design world is small. The computer chip design world is small, especially today. And that means if the word gets out that you've kind of put in a chip killer bug, then what's going to happen is that all the different companies that design computer chips are going to find out about that, and you're not going to have a job. So it's pretty much the end of your career if you put in a bad bug in a computer chip. So when a computer chip comes back from the fabrication facility, there's this thing hanging over everybody's head, is this going to be the end of my career? Let's turn it on and find out. Except on this day, when I've been reflecting on the past, all those designs, all of them equally pressing, equally vital for the company's well-being, equally threatening to one's career. And I wondered, after all those weekends and late nights, what was I left with? All those past projects how many are there they're just junk filling up the landfill. So this current prototype, treated like it's so valuable, it's going to be junk pretty soon. And what's the point? What's the point of all this work? But then I thought back to all the relationships that I had created with the coworkers. When I walked into that office, I noticed something. While the prototype was still all valuable, it was actually the meaningful and close relationships with the people that I worked with that had enduring value. Some of these relationships had been with me for 20 years, some 10, some just a couple of years. But while all these projects were destined for the landfill, the relationships would remain relevant. Then at that point, I felt convicted. Too often I put the needs of the project above the needs of my coworkers, above the needs of my family. And at times I allowed the stress of the job to drive me so hard I would be short with people, grumpy with teammates because of their failure to meet my expectations and to meet my needs. They were all becoming inconvenient for me, so I got very grumpy. And how easy it is for us to value a thing like a prototype and dismiss something that's like vital, like a relationship. And it's so strange because we would all behave as though these prototypes were the most precious thing on the planet. And it's just a thing, and everybody knew it. Everybody knew it was going to be in the trash can here in about a month or so. So on this day, walk into work, and there's this new prototype there, and I had a different perspective. I tuned into the relationships that were there and focused on those instead of preparing to power up the latest computer chip. And I noticed that most of my nerve-wracked anxiety was replaced with peace and calm. I think that's because I knew that even if my job came to an end that day, I would still have the relationships with those that were there. I don't think it's a coincidence, but my workplace conversion, this thing I'm talking about, happened right about the same time I was coming into the church. And at that time, I couldn't help but compare the value that we placed on these prototypes at work to the preciousness of the Eucharist at church. And I was thinking that if the prototype was really so vital, the way we treated it, how much more is the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus? Unlike some piece of electronics, the Eucharist doesn't degrade over time or go to the landfill. And as I contemplated this comparison, I became increasingly surprised by the fact that I could eventually receive the Eucharist once I became Catholic. And that's an astounding privilege. And here we have Abigail's going to have her first communion right here. And this is she's going to get to receive this amazing part of our faith here, this Eucharist. Now today we celebrate the Ascension. The Ascension is when Jesus literally lifted off the face of the earth and entered heaven bodily with his glorified physical body. Before that happened, Jesus told his disciples that he was going to leave so that he could send the Holy Spirit. So we know that this departure had a real impact. He's no longer walking the face of the earth, and people can't interact with him the way that we can interact with each other today, with one another. Yes, we can interact with Jesus spiritually, but it's not the same as the way the apostles interacted with Jesus, right? As he walked around the planet. And yet he said that he would be with us always until the end of the age. One can argue that there are many ways to be with Jesus, aside from the Eucharist. Perhaps people can say that Jesus is with us when we read the Bible, or when we gather in prayer, or when we're feeding the hungry or clothing the naked. And yes, all those things are true. But the difference between these ways of being with Jesus and the Eucharist is like the difference between, looking at a candle flame from a distance and feeling that candle flame with your hand. Both are experiences with the candle flame, but one has more intensity, an effect, a way of affecting you different than the other. Which is why I want to come back to relationship. When the apostles watched Jesus leave earth and ascend to heaven, what were they left with? All that work, all those years of living with Jesus here on earth, and doing all the things that they did, what were they left with? Their relationship with Jesus remained intact and would stay with them regardless of the upcoming hardships as they continued the ministerial efforts there. Jesus is with us just as he said he would be. Jesus is with us in the Eucharist in a most profound way. God himself desires a relationship with you. God desires to affect you as much as you're willing to allow. Placing yourself before the Eucharist, preparing yourself to receive it, and opening yourself to all those graces will change you in profound ways. Perhaps most of all, your relationship with God will grow and develop, and that will be an enduring treasure.